But it definitely is still an issue with men kind of being treated like they're not men or women, but women still getting a double standard in many rabbinic positions. That's a whole nother conversation outside of tonight's class. But the treatment of women rabbis or women heads of school and such is a very important topic that the Jewish professional world is addressing, but it still needs a lot of work. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is the whole questions that we're discussing are not merely theoretical, as hopefully you'll see from our discussion tonight in particular. All right, well, it is past 7:30 now, so I am not embarrassed to go ahead and begin. So I'm changing things up a little bit from the previously planned seminar. What I'd like to do tonight is to continue with She'elot Tshuvot, that is to say with our questions and answers, with the response to literature and how it has applied to the case of women. But I wanted to do sort of a middle discussion, which is going to bridge the gap between our discussion last week of women's role in the sanctuary, with reading Torah and with being on the bima, leading services and counting in a minyan and all of that. And next week, we're going to talk about women in more roles of authority, specifically a little bit of the history of women becoming rabbis and more recently women as witnesses, which is kind of the last glass ceiling, if you will, as an official legal matter. But tonight, to try and bridge that gap, I want to look at something that a lot of us take for granted, but which should not be taken for granted, and that is women in the books, specifically women in liturgy, the women in the brachot. One of the earliest ways that many people are introduced to the changes within the conservative movement is to the inclusion of women found in our prayers specifically, meaning in the text themselves. And understanding why that is and why some people oppose it and how it could happen and all of that is a very important part of understanding our movement and the responsive process. And it is also, I think, a very important emotional and spiritual point of understanding the responsiveness of Judaism throughout the millennia. So without more introduction, we're going to look at the women in the services themselves. Like I said, we talked about the women around the services, leading services, reading the Torah, and all of that. But tonight we're going to look at women in the text themselves. And specifically, there are going to be two main things we're going to look at. Well, 2.5, I guess you could say. One, we're going to look at the Amidah, and that's a much longer discussion. So I'm going to save that for the part two, that is to say, second half tonight. And first, we're going to look at women and other blessings. Now, some of you may be scratching your head. I don't have a lot of cameras on, unfortunately, so I can't tell how many of you are literally scratching your head. But many of you may be thinking, but Rabbi, I know about putting Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah into the Amidah. Where else are women in the liturgy? Where else do women show up? I mean, they are missing from everything else. Well, yes and no, because each morning we say a set of blessings which are trying to describe who we are and what we are grateful for. And as such, the classical liturgy that most people might be most familiar with, but by no means 100% universal, even throughout our history, just get that out there for the moment. Our classical liturgy begins in Berkot HaShachar, our blessings of the morning, and includes, in different orders, in different traditions, but all three of the following statements. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who did not make me a Gentile. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who did not make me a slave. Blessed are you, Adonai, King of the universe, who did not make me a woman. And if you are a woman and saying these blessings, obviously you can't say who didn't make me a woman. That would be untrue. Instead, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who made me according to his will. All right, so I'm going to pause real quick there because I would love to hear from those of you in our participation, male or female. what your thoughts would be on saying these statements each morning. And you can pick any one or all three of them. What would your thoughts be about if this was part of your morning routine? Does anyone have any thoughts or feelings on that? Or is everybody too shy? You don't have to turn on your camera, just your microphone. That's all you need.
It'll be uncomfortable in this DNA age.
It would be uncomfortable in this age. What would make it uncomfortable nowadays?
First of all, that we live among Gentiles. It's not like in the past that we used to live on isolation from the Gentile community. I'll be uncomfortable because the slavery that at that time, we don't have that institution, even though there's human trafficking. So I'll feel uncomfortable sympathizing with those victims of human trafficking. And I feel uncomfortable about the idea of making me a woman. I understand the rationale because being a woman at that time, it was a harsh life and many women died in childbirth. But things have changed. Yeah. Yes, go on.
No, so I'm going to say, just if I can try to summarize the point you're making, is you might feel uncomfortable saying all of these, the top three, the ones that are said by men, because it seems to be disparaging being a Gentile, being a slave, and being a woman. That it seems to be in some way, shape, or form going, phew, glad I'm not one of them. And that may be, even if true, certainly I'm glad I'm not a slave. I can say that with a clear conscience. It may still seem like I am disparaging those that are in that other status. And that is a rough emotional stance to try and take each morning. And I should point out that there's actually been controversy over some of these phrases, more than just modern times, more than just these days. It's not only in these days that it has been an issue, but let's talk a little. Whoops, sorry. So I'm just catching up with the chat. Someone commented that they would feel yuck. They say they don't have a voice, so they're not going to put that into conversation, but they would feel yuck. And I think they may be mirroring what you were just saying. Any other comments before we look at an early explanation of why we say it the way we do? Yes, Emma.
Thanks. I think it also just seems really exclusionary, and also I don't like how it's in the negative. You know, who did not do this, did not, and so there's something about the wording of that also just, I don't know, leaves a bad taste in my mouth. So, yeah.
Spoken like somebody who is very familiar with the written word and language. Indeed, these are unique among the morning brachot of being thanks given for not in the negative form. It is a extremely unusual way to create a blessing. We don't have any other blessings like these three. And that negativity is something that is, like I said, it's not noticed only uniquely in the modern world. Others in the past have noticed that as well. So let's, like I said, look at an explanation from the Talmud that tries to discuss these blessings. Interestingly enough, the Talmud has the other list that you may be more familiar with of blessings we say in Birkot HaShachar, in Brachot, in the other section of Talmud, but it's in Menachot that these three are discussed. So there is some controversy or discussion about whether these three really were a separate list. So in the Talmud, it says as follows: it is taught, Rabbi Meir would say, a man is obligated to recite three blessings every day: who has made me an Israelite, who did not make me a woman, and who did not make me an ignoramus. So straight off the bat, we can see that his formulation is not identical with our formulation, with what we have in our prayer book. He begins with the positive, who made me an Israelite, rather than the negative, didn't make me a non-Jew. He goes on to include, indeed, not a woman, but then instead of the slave, he has, who did not make me an ignoramus. The idea being, of course, that one who is a fool, one that is ignorant of Torah and how to live, would be at a severe disadvantage of being able to be a good person. It doesn't mean you have to be a genius to be righteous, but you do have to put a little more effort into it. Now, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov heard his son reciting the blessing, who did not make me an ignoramus. meaning that he heard his son basically quoting what Rabbi Meir would teach. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said to him, is it in fact proper to go this far? Right? Are you really supposed to say, thank you for not making me ignoramus? Rather, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov's son said to him, rather, what blessing should one recite, right? If you don't think that's an appropriate blessing, then what should I say? If you will say one should recite, who did not make me a slave, which was the other opinion at the time, that is the same as a woman. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov answered, a slave is more lowly. All right, so let's make sure we understand the description here, not prescription, that is happening in this conversation. None of them are saying that women and slave should be treated the same or that they are the same, but or rather that they are in fact or essence the same, but they are saying that in their world there is a hierarchy. And in the hierarchy, being Jewish is better than not being Jewish in the ancient world. And if you lived among the pagans that our ancestors did, you probably would come to a similar conclusion. And in their world, being a man rather than a woman was simply better. There were perks, there were privileges, economic and social, to say the least. And being a slave, well, being a slave was even worse than being a woman. Because slaves were in a much worse situation. And this seems to be a way of trying to express gratitude in a way that we find uncomfortable, but like Joseph was saying earlier, is meant to show at least some understanding of the privilege that a person has, that they are not in that other position. You know, thank you for making me a man doesn't necessarily, or thank you for not making me a woman doesn't necessarily mean that they think women are bad, but they are acknowledging that women are treated badly, or women have fewer rights or fewer privileges in their society. And is it inappropriate then to say thank you for making me in a position where I am not subject to that situation? I would imagine that many of you are still thinking, okay, I get that it's trying to maybe sensitize me to the hierarchy of society without saying it's good, but at least making sure that I can acknowledge. And indeed, in the modern world, people are often encouraged to recognize the privileges they may have, whether it be being born of a particular gender or of a particular race or of a particular nationality or simply in a particular economic situation that is a privilege. It is nice if you're born into a millionaire family compared to a family that is not a millionaire. Does that mean everything in your life is perfect? Of course. But can you recognize that you do have a lucky break by being in that family compared to being in a different one? That may be what's going on here. But we're still perhaps bothered by the negativity, by the not making me, and by the hierarchical structure. Maybe there is another way to phrase it. And indeed, if we look at the 15th century and the 1400s, we can find a very interesting text in the Siddur that was written in Italy, which those of you who can read the blurry quote of the Hebrew, has written in this Siddur, which was specially commissioned for a wealthy woman in Italy, that it says, Sha'asitani isha velo ish, which is basically saying, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who made me a woman and not a man. And then goes on to say, and didn't make me an ama v'shivcha, a female servant, and did not make me a nochrit, which would be a non-Jewish woman. So the other two still remain in the negative formulation. But here we get a positive and negative twist on being a woman, of saying, thank you for making me a woman and not a man. And the dig, if that's what we're calling it, is going against the man in that case. And indeed, we might wonder why, let me just flip back, in the classical formulation, women were not encouraged to say that formula that we see in the Italian Siddur. Why not say that men should say, thank you for making me a man and not a woman, and women should say, thank you for making me a woman and not a man? Why did they not originally say that? I think we can argue that this particular Siddur is representing a editorial choice by the person that was writing it for the person who it was commissioned by, meaning that as it was commissioned for a wealthy, important woman in Italy, the author was going to write it in a way that was a little bit more flattering to her. And that, again, is probably coming back to the truth that not making me a woman in the original formulation was a recognition of women's diminished status. This modification was a recognition that this particular woman had a better status, and thus it would have been inappropriate, which is introducing to us the idea that shouldn't we say the blessing in a way that we feel is most true, is most relevant? Can I really say, for not making me a woman or making me in God's image, when really, as a wealthy Italian aristocratic woman, perhaps I should be happy that I am a woman born into this family. Perhaps I need to express that in some honest and legitimate way. Now, when we get to Magen Avraham in the 17th century, he has, again, a rebuttal about this, where we have that phrase, who did not make me a non-Jew, that one should say the version that Shanu Yehudi is a change by the printers. So he was familiar, as some of you might also be, and with, indeed, the original Talmudic version of Who Made Me an Israelite, that some prayer books in his day were also saying, Who made me a Jew, a positive formulation. His concern, as with many others in that time period, was that that was not a legitimate tradition passed down generation to generation or an accepted change within some communities, but that was a forced change by the Christian censors. And it is true that the Christian church, the Catholic Church, did often require in the Talmud many changes in order to remove any hint of criticism of Christianity. Whether it was real or not, they often forced us to amend many of our books. Whether or not this was actually a change from the Christian censors or not, that's his opinion. But again, you can see that there was a tradition of taking the alternative view, which leads us to Rabbi Samuel Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century in Germany, who has the following to say. This is not a prayer of thanks that God did not make us heathens, slaves, or women. Rather, it calls upon us to contemplate the task which God has imposed upon us by making us free Jewish men, and to pledge ourselves to do justice to this mission. So Rabbi Hirsch was an amazing writer and a master of trying to capture the spirit of his day, the beginning of the Jewish Enlightenment, in a way that still conformed to what was for him traditional Judaism. As such, he is engaging in a reframing of the issue of why these other verses or other blessings were written. And he doesn't want us to think about it as a negative, although it definitely appears to have been a negative from the beginning, but we should reframe it. We should look at it in a different light, and instead should look at each of those things. Thank you for not making me a non-Jew. Thanking you for not making me a slave. And thank you for not making me a woman, as thanking God for giving me, a free Jewish man, more obligation. And indeed, in many Orthodox communities or prayer books, you will find that as the default explanation nowadays, trying to paper over some of the underlying issues with the idea that really this is only about how many commandments each person has. A woman has more commandments to be obligated to than a slave. A man has more obligations than a woman. And a Jewish person has more mitzvot than a non-Jew. And therefore, that means we should only look at this as a hierarchy of obligation, as Rabbi Hirsch says. It is a beautiful reframing, but that doesn't mean that we have to settle on it. The Orthodox world has taken a decision from the 1800s on that they are not going to tinker with the liturgy or prayers. They do, but that's another issue. But they would like to at least publicly say they're not. And as such, they wish to reframe Jewish prayer in this particular sense in a more positive modern light. However, the conservative movement says that's not necessary. We can use the exact same inyan, the same message and feeling of the blessing in a positive formulation and make it fit also within our modern sensibilities, and indeed not change anything from the ancient understanding that is truly the deeper essence. And so if you open up our Siddur, you will see that we are thanking God for making me a Jew, for making me free, and for making me in his image. And all of these are said by both men and women. And this is on our Lev Shalem, or the Sim Shalom that we use on weekdays, as a way of indeed making the blessing clearer for those that are reading it. And ultimately, that's going to be something that we have to wrestle with for the rest of tonight. What is the obligation of the current editors of the prayer book, of the current person using the prayer, to make the meaning of its deepest essence clear to all who use it? Are we, the reader, under an obligation to stretch beyond our initial reading, our knee-jerk reaction, to dig deeper into a deeper understanding of a prayer beyond our surface, maybe rejection or reaction? Or do we have an obligation, if we are editing or saying the prayers, to make some changes because we know that some hurdles are too high for many people? And that if we were to leave this as saying, who didn't make me a Jew, who didn't make me a slave, who didn't make me a non-Jew, and didn't make me a woman, that it would be left as a bridge too far, a problem for people to engage. So before we get into the question with the Amidah, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. Should we conform to the prayer book as we have received it, regardless of any surface abnormalities or issues that might seem off-putting? Or should we make changes when necessary in order to avoid those types of problems? What do you think? Are we preserving the Siddur as it is in amber, in like, behind glass, and then we change ourselves, regardless of what it may feel like that is saying? We can find a different meaning and feeling in it? Or are some things simply too ambiguous or unclear, and we need to make a few edits in order to properly capture what is the truth of that blessing? Or is everybody too shy to share their opinion? All right, we have a shy group. That's okay. Let's go ahead and dive into the Amidah then, because this is really where it becomes much more of a question of, well, do we or don't we? Can we or can't we? The Amidah, as you know, is the central blessing of the Jewish prayer service. It is the high point of any service where there isn't a Torah reading, and it is the high point just down a notch if there is a Torah reading. And as such, the Amidah is one of the places where we call for the greatest devotion and introspection and the most passionate focus of our feelings behind our words, which is why it's not a surprise that the blessing that begins the Amidah, known as the Avot, has raised a lot of questions in the modern world. The blessing begins, "Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, the Almighty, the Great, the Powerful, the Awesome," and then continues. You may be more familiar with it in the Shabbat melody mode, the blessing going, "Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, velohei avoteinu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, velohei Yaakov, Ahel Hagadol," and so on. Or you may not be familiar with it quite like that, because at Temple Israel, we have an addition. After we say the God of Jacob, we go on to also say the God of Sarah, the God of Rebekah, the God of Rachel, and the God of Leah. Why is that done? Before we go into can it be done and how it is authorized to be done, which is our tshuvot process, why do you think there might have been a push to include the names of the matriarchs alongside the patriarchs in this blessing? Of course, everybody's still going to be very quiet tonight because they're all very Zoom shy.
To take their leadership position, maybe, or like just to recognize them as matriarchs, saying they played a part.
These are matriarchs. They played a part, right? Abraham would not have had Isaac without Sarah. I mean, literally, physically impossible having Isaac without Sarah. And indeed, we know from the stories of Abraham and Isaac from Abraham and Sarah, that Sarah was instrumental in guiding the family. It was not 100% only Abraham doing everything. Sarah was rather consequential, as was Rebecca, and as were Rachel and Leah. So they had a place, they had a role, they were important. Why would we not also include them in the list along with the names of their husbands? I see another hand up, Joseph.
Also, another interpretation is that it reinforces one of the interpretations of why we wrapped the tefillin 7 times, that it is in honor of our ancestors, which is the 3 fathers and the 4 mothers.
Right. There are many times included in the meditation of putting on tefillin and many other ways as well, that we also reflect upon the matriarchs. It's not as though they are ignored within our tradition. So why would we ignore them in the avot? Why would we ignore them in this blessing when we are highlighting the connection of the Jewish people at its inception through the different generations of our founders? Why would we ignore their presence there? Judy, I think your hand is up too.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The prayer seems to be just mentioning who has a relationship with God, and it's not alluded to as much in the Torah that God has a relationship with the matriarchs, but there are enough allusions to make it clear that God did have a relationship with our matriarchs as well as the patriarchs. And so, it's different with each individual one, but we want to acknowledge that God had relationships with all of these ancestors, the women as well as the men.
Right, that it's not as though God had no relationship with the matriarchs. They definitely did, sometimes directly, sometimes a little bit more obliquely alluded to, as you mentioned. But if we are taking this blessing and talking about the relationship of our different founders to God, should we not mention the relationship of the other half of the founders and having that connection? A very good point. But you're also drawing us closer to the idea that absent the listing of those names, we might indeed doubt all the things that have been mentioned so far. Kathy, I think your hand's up.
Yeah, it is. Well, and the other part is, looking at it on the other side, as women in the conservative movement have taken more of a role in synagogue life and in prayer life, it would feel like there wasn't a real place for them if in the Amidah you didn't mention the women. And I know growing up without having mentioned to the women and now mentioning it, I feel much better in this form of the prayer than I did as a young woman and felt like we were just invisible.
Right. Representation matters. It's not something that's just a buzzword for Hollywood or for the media or in sports. Representation matters. And for women to feel that here is a list of the amazing people that got Judaism going, and none of the ladies were mentioned, for women in particular, that would be very potentially disheartening. It doesn't mean everyone would take it that way, but like Kathy was saying, many could feel invisible or unnoticed or underappreciated at this statement, which means we then have to really ask, well, why was this statement written the way it was written? Why did the sages, when they put together the Amidah, say, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov? Why was that chosen? which means we have to ask who chose it in the first place, right? Whenever we're talking about our liturgy, we have to talk about where that liturgy came from. The fact that we all have a prayer book which is 99% similar to all other prayer books means that someplace this got started. And we'll look at Mishnah Torah, where there's a discussion about this process to get going. So if you'll bear with me for a little history in the words of Rambam. When the people of Israel went into exile in the days of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, they mingled with the Persian, Greeks, and other nations. That's part of the exile. In those foreign countries, children were born to them whose language was confused. Everyone's speech was a mixture of many tongues, right? Children were being born in other countries. They were being raised with dialects, pidgins, and mixtures of languages, as the life of a refugee often results in. No one was able, when he spoke, to express his thoughts adequately in any one language, otherwise than incoherently, as it said, and the children spoke half in the speech of Ashdod, and they could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people, taken from Nehemiah when talking about this time period. So the language was mixed, it was confused. We lacked an elegant form of expression. Consequently, when any one of them prayed in Hebrew, which would have been a foreign language to them, he was unable to adequately express his needs or recount the praises of God without mixing Hebrew with other languages. So this means that when a person would get up to pray, privately or in part of the group, there would be a confusion. Indeed, it would be similar to a modern situation where many people still do not know Hebrew at all close to fluency. And Hebrew and English are often intermingled. And this is talking about where that would be done where there were no printed books, but whoever was leading would be doing some things in Hebrew, some things in their Greek or Persian, and it would be very hard for anyone else to also follow or understand it. Thus, when Ezra and his council realized this condition, they ordained the 18 benedictions in their present order, meaning the Amidah as we have it. The first blessing, of course, being the avot that we're talking about. The first 3 blessings consist of praises of God, and the last 3 of thanksgiving to him. The intermediate benedictions are petitions for things which may stand as categories of all the desires of the individual and the needs of the community. Of course, on Shabbat and holidays, we take those 13 middle ones and we condense them down to just one blessing, thanking for the day. The object aimed at was that these prayers should be in an orderly form in everyone's mouth, that all should learn them, and thus the prayer of those who were not expert in speech would be as perfect as those who had command of a chaste style. I love the old translation. For the same reason, they arranged all the blessings and prayers for all Jews so that the substance of every blessing should be familiar and current in the mouth of one who is not expert in speech. So what Rambam is trying to answer here is, why are our blessings so short and so simple? And in fact, the Hebrew of them is incredibly low in its vocabulary. It is not, you're reading at a 12th grade level. It is something that most young people, if they knew a bit of Hebrew and a little more practice, would be able to follow the Amidah text fairly clearly. And because of its brevity and style, would be able to memorize with relative ease. It is not a huge undertaking to do so. And that's, by the way, a challenge to anyone who would like to learn more Hebrew and like to learn the Amidah. If you want more advice, I'll be happy to fill you in on that. And he's saying that's because it was deliberately simplified into this form, and it was done so that everyone would be able to participate. Now, notice that goal. The goal was not to preserve or crystallize. The goal was to make the blessings understandable and usable and equal for everyone. So there wouldn't be some people of amazing erudition that would be able to spout beautiful poetry and phrase after phrase after phrase of elegant Shakespearean style Hebrew. And then some other poor schlemiel who would get up there and stumble through their mixture of Greek and Hebrew and feel like they were being made a fool in front of the community. This would give everybody the same template, and of course, be able to extemporanea, to add to on their own ability, but at least this core ability would be shared by everyone. To know more about how we can be creative, we can look at the class I just did in Pathways, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So with that in mind, that the Amidah as we have it is understood to have been brought together for this purpose, we then look at the source material for the passage that we are investigating, the passage of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And no, we don't, because I apparently put that in a different place. Just a second. I'm going to have to go to that page because I've mentioned it too much. And where did I put it? All right. I apparently hit it all the way at the end. All right. Okay. Did I not include that prayer? That passage? I am embarrassing myself. Where did I? This is the problem that happens when you try to do things in technology, because you end up, there we are. Nope, that's not it. We'll get back to that one. All right, so I'm going to have to go off topic. I somehow in my juggling of the slides, I must have deleted that one. So the phrase, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, is the quote from God to Moses at the burning bush. When Moses asks God, who do I tell them sent me when I go to the Israelites and say, the God of your ancestors is going to set you free? Who do I say sent me? What am I supposed to give as an explanation? And God says, you will tell them, quote, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob is sending you. Okay, so if it's a quote, are we allowed to tinker with it? Are we allowed to edit a quote? Are we allowed to add a phrase after the quote, which is not a quote? Well, yeah. What changes can we make? Well, let's take a look a little bit at Rambam again about changes that are possible. So as he points out, the forms of all the blessings were established by Ezra and his court. It is not proper to vary them or add to or take anything away from them, from any one of them. Whoever deviates from the form which the sages have given to the blessings is in error. Any blessing in which the name of God and his sovereignty are not mentioned is not regarded as a blessing unless it follows immediately after another blessing. Don't worry about that last sentence so much. It's not too relevant for our discussion tonight. But look at that top part. No changes allowed. Nothing, nothing, nothing. You can't add, you can't take away. All right, so I guess we're stuck. We are all in violation of Jewish law for saying the God of Sarah, the God of Rebecca, and so on. Because Rambam says we can't, and Rambam is based off the Talmud. We seem to be having some trouble. However, the very next paragraph in the same book of Rambam, all blessings may be recited in any language, provided that the form instituted by the sages is followed, meaning the overall structure. And if the form has been changed, the duty of reciting the blessing is discharged, meaning you have done it okay, since the name of God and his sovereignty, as well as the subject matter of the blessing, have been mentioned, even though in a foreign tongue. So can you pray in another language? Of course, even though that is different than what the Ezra and his court put together. Can you even change some of the underlying, some of the ways we express it, as long as the underlying theme and overall structure remains the same? Yes, you can do that too. So which is it? Are we not allowed to change anything and it has to be 100% the way we got it? Or are we allowed to change things and doing so is just as good as if we did it in the perfect, pristine Hebrew? Well, Rambam doesn't give us a clear answer, but some commentary will help us a little bit on this. But I should point out a little bit of a reality check. And the reality check is we have changed things. The reality check is that things do change from time to time. And in fact, we can get an example from very early on. And this is taken from the tshuva, the responsa in the conservative movement regarding including the names of the matriarchs in the Amidah. which was written by Rabbi Joel Rembam. And he quotes from the text of Sadia Gaon, which is one of the earlier versions of the prayer book. A good example of the impact on liturgy of a significant theological development is Rabbi Sadia's reaction to the reference to the light that shines on Zion, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir. This phrase is added at the conclusion of Yotzer Or. Yotzer Or is the first blessing in the morning Shacharit service, where we are thanking God for light. Rabbi Sadia argued that since the prayer refers to the light of creation and not to the light of the Messianic age, a new light that will shine on Zion, that such allusions are unacceptable, right? Sadia Gaon said, there is this newfangled group, and they're saying Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir. They added this sentence to Yotzer Or, and that sentence, not only is it new, which doesn't seem to be his main problem, but worse, it's not on topic. It is changing the theme of the prayer from being only about appreciating the light of creation to an anticipation of the light of redemption. And that metaphor is inappropriate in this prayer. Well, Rab Shavira, one of the other Gaonim from that time period, in response to Rabbi Sadia's comment, noted that the reference has always been accepted in the academies and is appropriate for the prayer. That, yes, it may be an introduction of a slightly different theme than the one that you thought the blessing was only about, but this has already received widespread acceptance in many of the other learned institutions, and there's no reason to believe that this is completely beyond the pale. To include the Or Chadash phrase in the Yotzer Or is close enough to the overall theme of creation, for after all, the Messianic age is the ultimate goal of creation. And so why can't we also mention this as well? Is this a slam dunk argument? Well, not according to Sadia Gaon. He would have been much happier if we did not say that line. However, if you will look at our service, you'll note we still say Or Chadash, but Rav Sadia Gaon lost. That as much as he objected to this inclusion of this line about light and the Messianic age, it has become part of our prayers, and you will hear it wherever you go, except for a very few number of Sephardic communities that do not, that follow his ruling. So this has become normalized as being acceptable. So to go back to our question with Rambam, can we make changes or not? The answer appears to be yes, some changes can be made, and some changes that are in keeping with the theme of the blessing can be made, but perhaps we shouldn't be doing it so recklessly, might be the argument. And indeed, Rembam goes on to say in that same tshuva, Kesef Mishneh, one of the major commentaries on Rambam, concludes his comment on Hilchot Brachot, the section we were reading, by emphasizing that the permissive statement of the Rambam in that paragraph is in a case where one has changed the wording of the blessing while retaining the basic theme and not altering its peticha, the opening, or its chatima, the closing structure, meaning that you've kept the bookends that the sages established, but you changed some of the wording of the middle, but not the theme of the middle, and therefore it is okay. And indeed, this seems to be what has become the normal practice throughout the centuries, certainly before the printing press, which is why you will find small variations in the wording around the world. In communities that are around the Jewish globe, you will find different interpretations of exactly how to word certain of the blessings. And I remember very distinctly when I was invited to lead a service with a Sephardic Siddur that was of significant enough changes that it threw me off on most pages because the words were not exactly the same words that I was most used to. All right, so maybe we can make a change. But, says Rabbi David Galinkin of the 21st century, if we add Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah to the Avot, why not add Joseph, Moses, Aaron, and David, as we do in Ushpizim, the practice of inviting people in for the Sukkah? Or Moses, Aaron, and David, as we do in the Mishaberach for the sick. Why don't we mention them for that as well? because these fathers were not the founding fathers of our nation. And if we add Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, why not add Bilhah and Zilpah, the handmaidens? For there are midrashim which state that there were 6 matriarchs. Now, before you get too mad at Rabbi Galinkin, please understand he is a conservative rabbi. He is a current conservative rabbi serving in the land of Israel, and he has obviously a different opinion than Rabbi Rambam that we saw in the previous slide, that is a conservative rabbi serving in the United States. Rabbi Galinkin and many other conservative rabbis feel that including the matriarchs does actually change the theme, because the theme wasn't about listing important men. For if we were listing important men, we would have to also talk about Moses, Aaron, David, Solomon, and any others. But instead, that it was talking about listing the founding fathers as the fathers, literally fathers of the nation, as they were listed in the quote by God to Moses to give to the people. As such, adding Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah does not fit that rubric. And indeed, if we were just listing important people, we would also have to list Bilhah and Zilpah. So his argument is that it is not appropriate to add them. And to the best of my knowledge, he has not changed his opinion. This is something he wrote, I believe, in like 2006, 7, 8, somewhere in there. And he still feels that we should not include. And you may have already caught on to that idea, because if you look in Lev Shalem, you'll notice that there are 2 versions of this blessing. There are versions that include the matriarchs that we use, and there is a version that does not include the matriarchs, which we do not use, but many other conservative congregations do, precisely because they feel that the change is not appropriate. Questions or comments before we continue to look at the back and forth on this point? I've sort of gone for a while. Yes, Debbie.
So I don't know whether everybody ever heard your explanation as to why, although it's included, there's many times in the Siddur that says imahot, but we only say avot.
Yes.
Could you explain that, please?
I can, because that's my last section for tonight. So it's already in the slideshow, but you'll have to hold on for that. So, but thank you for the preview. But what Debbie's asking about is why we do include the names of the matriarchs, but we don't include the title of the matriarchs. The phrase imahot, meaning our matriarchs, or matriarchs, or imotenu, meaning our matriarchs. So we'll come back to that near the end of tonight. So let's talk a little bit more about that closing, however, because the closing is also a quote. When we talk about Magen Avraham at the end, that is a reference to Genesis 15. Sometime later, the word of the Lord came to Abram in the vision, and he said, "Fear not, Abram, I am a shield to you, a Magen. Your reward shall be very great." As such, we say Magen Avraham. But we did mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why are we only mentioning Abraham in the conclusion? Well, it comes from the Talmud. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." The initial blessing given to Abraham in Genesis 12. "And I will make you a great nation." This is fulfilled in the opening of the Amidah, as they say, God of Abraham. "And I will bless you." This is fulfilled when they say God of Isaac, as it is a blessing for a father when the name of his son is eternalized. "And I will make your name great." This is fulfilled when they say God of Jacob. After all, Jacob becomes the name of the Jewish people for the people of Israel. Now, one might have thought that the Jews should conclude the first blessing with the names of all the forefathers. Therefore, the verse states, "And you will be a blessing." That is to say, with you will be a blessing. Avraham, they will conclude the blessing, and they will not conclude with the mention of all the forefathers. This is why the first blessing of the Amidah prayer ends with shield of Avraham, Magen Avraham, shield of Abraham. So what the Talmud is arguing here in the name of Reish Lakish is that we should understand that all 3 were also included as a praise of Abraham, but Abraham stands alone at the end because after all, he is the ultimate one. He is the one that will be the blessing. So let's use his name in that singular blessing phrase, Magen Avraham. That should, of course, raise the question, is it appropriate to add Sarah next to him in that blessing in particular? Even if we were to say it's okay to add Sarah to the first half, God of Sarah, God of Rachel, etc., Rebecca, etc., maybe the last line should have remained only Abraham, because after all, the other guys weren't mentioned there either. If they were not able to share that line with Abraham, then maybe Sarah shouldn't share that line with him as well. And indeed, there is some objection, again, from Rabbi Galinkin in his writings on this, with the phrase upoked Sarah, that particular phrase that we use, because, as was already explained by Rabbi Harlow in the other pages that he quotes, the word poked appears in the Bible 10 times, meaning the actual version poked appears 10 times. The root word appears many more times, but the full version poked appears 10 times. And in every case, it means visit the sins or visit the guilt, as in the verses who visits the sins of the parents on the children, or other references from Exodus 20, 34, Numbers 14, Deuteronomy 5, and others. So we use the term poked Sarah to mean God is mindful of Sarah, but isn't that like using almost like a negative word? It seems like someone messed up their grammar. Well, there is a reason why we use the word poked. It is to be parallel to Abraham. Just as one verb was used with Abraham to protect the shield Magen, so too there is one verb that is uniquely directed at Sarah, and that is Vadonai pakad et Sarah, that God took note of, God remembered her, God made her pregnant at this time, or allowed her to conceive, and he did as he had spoken. So when our conservative movement was looking for a verb that would uniquely connect to Sarah herself, rather than just a generic word like the Reform synagogues that use the phrase the help of Sarah, they wanted to find a verb. And really, pakad is the only verb that is directly connected to Sarah in this way. Therefore, they wanted to make it the word pakad, but of course, pakad is the past tense. It isn't a participle. And so they had to put it in the participle form, which is poked, even though poked can sometimes have a negative connotation. So language and grammar is hard, but this was them trying to wrestle with it into the form in order to be able to include her with a textually supported verb that would go along with her and her identity. Now, you still may not be convinced about any of the changes that we've talked about. So I will remind you, and if you've watched my other classes, you'll be familiar with some of these texts. Rabbi Yaakov ben Meir rules that one may be creative with all 18 blessings. That means all of them, not only some of the middle ones, whether for words of thanks and praise, which indeed is what the avot is, or for one's needs, since one is merely extrapolating on the theme of the blessing, that we are given permission to extrapolate on the theme. And if we feel it's necessary to extrapolate on the theme with regards to Sarah or the other matriarchs, that we are given permission to do so. Additionally, from the 13th century, Rav Yom Tov ben Avraham said, if one could not fulfill one's obligations with such changes, the sages should have recorded the text of the blessings and specified the exact number of the words, which they didn't. You can look through the entire Talmud, and you will not find the entirety of any of the blessings that are in the Amidah. You will find samples of them, and you will find the closing blessings, but you will not find the whole blessings, nor will you find even a counting of there should be like 32 words in this blessing. It is instead clearly intended to have room for interpretation and creativity. As such, we do have the right to make the emendations that we've seen. All right, so before we get to the language of gender and inclusion along that grammatical axis, I want to just give a little pause for questions or comments on the inclusion of the imahot. Hopefully you'll understand that it is not a slam dunk that those changes are there. That is why there is the alternative version and why it is perfectly acceptable for a conservative synagogue to not include them. because they might truly believe that the changes are not justified. On the other hand, hopefully you've seen there is significant support and justification for making those changes. And indeed, that is why we do those passages at Temple Israel. That diversity within the conservative movement, I believe, is one of our strengths. And I think that having the conversation about which we choose raises our awareness more and makes the prayer more meaningful, regardless of which version you end up using for your own personal or congregational use. All right, I'm not seeing any hands and I'm not seeing anyone unmuting. So let's take a little look at some grammar. And I apologize to those of you who were abused by language teachers and hate the word grammar, but it is kind of important to understand a little bit, because one of the major hangups that many people have over Hebrew is the fact that it is a heavily gendered language, meaning that words have a gender to them. If I talk about the shulchan, I am talking about a table, but in Hebrew, a shulchan is going to take a masculine form of the verbs and the adjectives or pronouns. I will be talking about him, the table, when I am using the verb, or when I'm using pronouns for the table. And when I conjugate, I will be following the masculine declensions and the masculine conjugations and the masculine inflections for everything that has to do with that table. And if I talk about the shemesh, the sun, I will be doing the exact same, but using the feminine form. It is she, the sun. Hebrew does not have an it form. Hebrew uses these forms for everything in the world and everything that can be conceived of, and does not mean them as being reflective of gender, meaning that when I talk about shulchan, I am not thinking in masculine terms. I am not thinking that somehow the table is a rugged Neanderthal out there hunting the wildebeest, while the shemesh is the woman at home, grinding grain. That there are no gender stereotypes associated with which word got which version of the gender inflection. It appears to be relatively random, except for things like people or animals that have a masculine and feminine form, in which case it's a little bit more obvious. So what happens, however, when we get to more complicated situations, like, for example, collective nouns? Right, for countries and places is often female as another, as someone also pointed out in chat. Yes. When we get to collective nouns, it can get a little bit more confusing. If we say the word woman in Hebrew, it is isha. If we say the word women in Hebrew, it is nashim. And you may remember the phrase isha from our early discussion about the Birkot HaShachar, the morning blessings. We say the word man, we say ish. When we say the word min, we say anashim. But that's if we are talking about a pure group of women or a pure group of men, 100% of one gender. What do we do in Hebrew when we have a mixed group? Well, we say anashim. We use anashim, the masculine plural form, as a default blended group. This doesn't necessarily mean that one drop of men erases all of the women. It is simply the grammatical form that Hebrew uses, and it is meant to be treated as a gender-neutral form. Hebrew doesn't have a gender-neutral form, so it uses the plural masculine as a gender-neutral or gender-indeterminate when necessary, in order to talk about any group of collective people or collective objects that are of a mixed gender form. Which brings us to our language of imahot and avot. Throughout this entire discussion, you may have noticed that sometimes we have been saying that the word av means father and the word avot means fathers. And sometimes I have been saying the word avot means ancestors. Likewise, the word mother would be em, and the word mothers would be imahot. But if we are talking about both the fathers and the mothers, then following the grammatical form of Hebrew, we would say avot, in order to make sure that it is the gender-inclusive form, meaning ancestors. If we were to say avot ve'imahot, if we were to put both as separate words side by side, then that would mean that avot had to be translated as patriarchs or fathers, and imahot had to be translated as matriarchs. Now, coming back to Debbie's earlier question, in our Sidurim, you will find oftentimes in brackets the word imahot or imotenu as a addition every place you find the word avot or avotenu, meaning our fathers or our ancestors. When you put the imahot word next to it, then by grammatical definition and the inescapable gravity of logic, then you are rendering the word avot as being only masculine, as being purely about the fathers. That I believe to be a problem, personally. Some people believe that that's necessary in order to put the women more on the page. I personally find that it is abusing the gender-neutral plural of Hebrew and will create more problems long-term for sense of representation of people, of different types of people, not only women, but also people that have different non-binary gender identities. The word avot is intended to mean ancestors unless it is explicitly non-ancestral, meaning that it is not inclusive of all ancestors. In our current formulation at Temple Israel and most other conservative synagogues, where we mention both the male ancestors and the female ancestors, the word avot should be patently clear as meaning ancestors in a gender-neutral inclusive term. So I do not feel it necessary to include the word imahot, and in fact, it over-gender sensitizes, over-gender hypersexualizes the text by adding in the word imahot as though they are not represented through the grammatical form of the gender plural or the masculine plural gender neutral form. That was a mouthful. All right. So we're going to leave it with there because I've already gone over time, but I was trying to be closer this time than I was last when I went way over. So any questions or comments that you would like to finish up with? Just a reminder, while you're thinking about anything you might like to say or ask, our next session, we are going to take what we've learned in the first two, and we're going to look at a little bit more of the history of women actually in the Jewish world and some of the questions that have arisen, and specifically look at how women eventually became rabbis and how we eventually have the shattering of the glass ceiling of women as witnesses, which it may surprise you to learn was sort of the last major threshold to receive a approved opinion within the conservative movement for allowing women to have equal status. So that will be next time. All right. I'm not seeing anyone unmuting or raising hands, so we will wrap it up tonight. Thank you all so much for joining me. I love talking halakha and grammar and appreciate getting this time to study together. Hopefully you'll have a deeper appreciation. Thank you, Baruch Ti. Have a deeper appreciation for Judaism, our prayer, and the history of how we make this all work. And hopefully when you are actually praying, you will be a little more mindful of the words as they are being said by your lips and take them to heart.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hasaku Baruch. Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone, and be well.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.